Good morning, everyone. So, as Tamar indicated, I'm going to be presenting on behalf of the JPC alongside my colleague, Jonathan Isaacs. And I'll start off the presentation this morning by first looking at some of the statistics, provide a snapshot without cause if I didn't at least indicate what productivity improvement meant. When we look at productivity, we're referring to the amount of output that we can get from each unit of input. When we think about inputs, we might be thinking about labor or capital. And so when referring to productivity improvement, we're thinking about how we can achieve an increase in the amount of output or the value of output that can be produced from each unit of input. Now, this is important because any basic economic theory will let you know that we cannot have long-term and sustainable economic growth without an improvement in productivity. So in other words, we can increase our standard of living with what we already have. So we're producing more without what we already have without having to use more. This is important because it allows us to increase our profits, our wages. It reduces inefficiency. It reduces waste in time and money. It will allow for better attitude amongst our workers, and it will help to promote better organizational systems and processes. So looking at Jamaica over the last 2 decades, ending in 2019, we can look at some statistics for productivity. So first, focusing on total factor productivity. Total factor productivity includes all elements or inputs in productivity and how much output we can get from each of those elements. So we're not only thinking about capital and labor, but we're also thinking about things like research and development, technological process, synergies, partnerships, social connections, among other things. And if we look at the graphs to the left, we see that over that 20-year period, total factor productivity has generally been declining, and on average, it has declined by 0.02%. And capital productivity, which is the amount of output that we can get for each dollar of capital that's dedicated towards a production process, we find that it also on average has been declining by 0.2% over that 2-decade period. So as we saw declines in total factor productivity and capital productivity in 2019, we actually saw increases or a slight increase in labor productivity for 2019. However, we note that the labor productivity for Jamaica is relatively low compared to other countries in the world in its income bracket and even within the Caribbean. And then on top of that, we note that labor productivity over the years has also been declining. In fact, it has been declining at an average annual rate of 0.6%. Now to the right, you will see a list of the annual average change for labor productivity by a year. And you would note that for most of the industries, there was an annual decrease in terms of labor productivity, but for a few industries such as agriculture and electricity supply, hotels and restaurants, and transport and storage and communications, there have been increases in productivity on average. But the great question is, what has happened in 2020? Well, based on preliminary estimations about the revalue added changes for the year, we anticipate that output per worker for 2020 would have fallen. And this fall would have been pushed largely by the decrease in services such as hotels and restaurants and other services that were impacted in terms of its supply and demand from the impacts of COVID-19 and the measures that have been implemented in order to quell its spread. However, there were some industries that had experienced an increase in output per worker for the year, such as electricity and water supply, as well as finance and insurance services. And what this indicates really is that these industries, despite the limitations in the movement of labor for the period, were probably able to adjust through the use of different management techniques or through the use of more technology to the impacts of the pandemic. Now let's break it down from the year and go now into the quarter. So if you look at quarterly changes, specifically if we hone in on the period October to December 2020, we can look at 2 series of changes. One over the year. So the red represents the changes over the year. So that would be October to December 2020 versus October to December 2019. And then we can also look at the quarter change. So that would be in green, which would reflect the percentage change moving from October October to December 2020 compared to July to September 2020. So you see, if we look at the year change, that several industries such as hotels and restaurants, as well as transportation and storage, would have been experienced a decline in output per worker, largely due to the decline in real value added, due of course to the pandemic. However, if we look now at the quarterly changes, we find that the hotels and restaurants registered an increase or anticipated increase in output per worker, largely due to an increase in, or kind of a sort of a movement towards recovery as it relates to number of tourist arrivals. We also saw an increase in output per worker for industries such as manufacturing and other services. However, that increase is largely due to a continued decline in the number of persons being employed to those sectors. On the other hand, we have declines in areas such as electricity and water supply, transportation and storage and communication over the quarter. And this reflects a recovery in the amount of persons that have been employed back in these sectors when we compare quarter over quarter changes. So what we see here is that we have a challenge, not only in 2020, but historically in terms of the level of productivity and improvements in productivity in Jamaica. So the question is, where do these challenges stem from? And if we look at the firm level, we first identify, or another way to think of it is a job or skill mismatch. Then we realize that there are probably challenges in the quality of the workers in terms of their education and their skills compared to the requirements of the job. So normally we anticipate that when you have higher quality workers, you anticipate to have an improvement in productivity. But if there's a mismatch, then you have a situation where either the worker is being underpaid or overpaid, and this does not bode well for productivity. Another important issue is competitiveness. Now, the last global competitiveness report reflected that Jamaica's level of competitiveness compared to the rest of the world was a rank of 80 compared to, or out of 141 countries. Now, research has shown that firms that tend to have higher markups also tend to have lower levels of productivity. And this could be related to a number of reasons. One, they're not able to access the right amount of quality of inputs at the right prices. It may be the scale of the organization. And so this is an important issue that needs to be accounted for and addressed. Another issue is management practices. When we look at management practices, we realize that firms that have better management practices tend to have better quality employers, because better managers are able to identify the necessary skills and competencies that are necessary for the job. In addition to that, they're better able to retain these workers over a longer period of time. Additionally, we find that there's a lack of the appropriate investments in managerial talent and skills that are necessary to help improve productivity. And it's important to note that we're talking about not only people management, such as human resources, but also in terms of process and systems management. We definitely cannot think about productivity improvements without talking about technology. Without technological progress, there can be no long-term gains for productivity. And what we also find, and what research has shown us, is that firms that find it easier to adopt to new technologies that are appropriate will have better and long-term gains in productivity. Another problem we find in the Caribbean in general is that there's a very low level of investments in research and development. Research and development is necessary to drive the innovation that will help to push productivity. Furthermore, with the application of technology, we find that we can have more economic complexity in our exports, which means we can have higher value exports that will help us to earn more income. And definitely, when we talk about productivity, we have to think about the persons that are helping us to produce. So the workers, the employers, the laborers. We want to think about issues that relate to social affirmation to make sure that there are policies that allow them to have a voice. We want to make sure that they understand how much they are appreciated in the production process in terms of their value as a person as well as their work. We also want to look at holistic well-being. So we want to look at mental health. We want to look at physical health, financial health, spiritual health. These things are all important because persons that are not well are not able to attend work, or even if they do attend work, oftentimes they may not be working to their full potential. And so we have to consider this in a context where we have a country where over 50% are obese and 1 in 3 persons have experiences with hypertension. And lastly, while we recognize that management practices are going to be important, we also have to not think about just management of processes and skills, but we also have to think about leadership. And with leadership, we have more engaged workers that have better attitudes. So now, having looked at those areas, I'm going to turn over to Jonathan, who will explore the case study as indicated.